Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Luffy ate both dragon and gum gum devil fruit part 2. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support the BlueMoonChaos for writing that awesome fanfic and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. Let's start this video. Sabo had kept watch while Luffy dozed. It was too much to hope for the younger one to give in to his body's demands and actually sleep. They were surrounded by enemies, trapped, couldn't get to Ace, and Lu was still too stressed and wound up. Partially shifting helped to quell some of his restlessness, but Sabo knew his little brother still needed to appease his instinct to completely take on his true form. This just bought them a little time. When the desire became too strong, Sabo was praying that they'd finally be off this vessel with their idiot hothead brother in tow and someplace safe where no one would see, preferably back in their shared cabin back on the wild card. Only once had Sabo been afraid they'd been discovered. Sensing people in the hull outside, both boys put in an even greater effort of hiding their presence. Sabo almost groaned aloud when he remembered how dusty the damn closet was. Their footprints were all over the floor and probably easy to spot with the addition of some light. Sharing this with Luffy, they prepared for the likely chance their hideout was discovered. When someone had opened the closet door and came in to look around, stopping by the shelf Sabo had used to hide the nook, they thought were done for. Thankfully, the person turned and left without any hint they knew the boys were there. Still, Sabo waited until Luffy said he couldn't hear anyone else walking around nearby before they eased up on suppressing their presence. Luffy settled back down to rest and Sabo resumed his vigil. It wasn't long after the near run-in that Luffy informed him of the really strong auras closest to them were leaving. Carefully extending his kiss, Sabo found that the auras were congregating together, leaving all the weaker ones to continue searching. Though curious as to why the strong people had left, Luffy mentioned that Ace was close to waking and had given their older brother the impression to fake being asleep once he awoke. Now was as good a time as any to try a second rescue attempt. The only problem they had was how to navigate the maze-like interior of the ship to get to where they sensed Ace was being held. Oh, and how to avoid being caught. After a few minutes, Luffy said that Ace was awake and had sensed several people outside the room he was laying in. Sabo figured these to be guards to prevent either Ace escaping or he and Luffy from getting to their brother. Talking to Ace relieved some of Luffy's worry and the boy was able to relax a little, taking over the task of watch while Sabo planned out their method of snatching Ace and getting off the ship. Checking to make sure nobody was outside the closet and that the commanders were still all together, Sabo removed the shelf and items placed on it before going over and opening the door a crack. The blonde asked Luffy to look around and show him what the younger saw. The older grinned in delight when the younger confirmed what he thought was there. Earlier, when Sabo was shuffling about the room when the two had first gotten there, he'd seen some old jars and cans of miscellaneous cleaning supplies on the upper shelves. Thanks to a little accident caused by one of their crew a while back, he knew that combining a few of these together and shaking them to get air in the mix would create smoke. It was largely harmless, only mildly irritating to the eyes and perhaps the nose if he got the mix right, and could be used to make the enemy crew panic and think their ship was on fire. In the ensuing panic and chaos, they could meet up with Ace and hightail it out of there. Relaying the plan to Ace, the older agreed that he would make his escape once the guards left. Failing that, he would wait until Sabo and Lu gave him the signal and then just use his flames to burst right through them. Sabo gave a mild rant about Ace not causing another explosion and to make sure he kept a low profile. It wouldn't do any good to broadcast an alert that they were escaping again. With Luffy watching through the crack in the door, Sabo used the meager lighting to mix up his impromptu smoke bombs. Plugging the tops of the cans used to house the concoction with ripped pieces of blanket, he had Luffy use his talons to poke a few holes along one side of each. The blonde just hoped he was right and that this half-baked plan of his would even work. Before taking off to where they sensed Ace, Luffy shifted back to his fully human shape, struggling a bit as he did so with Sabo checking him over to make sure nothing was forgotten. It's happened before. As a just-in-case sort of measure, Sabo tore two large squares off one of the dusty blankets. After shaking and snapping them to remove most of the dust, he folded them into bandanas and tied one around Luffy's face to cover the younger's mouth and nose. He did the same for himself with the other. Trusting his brother's actions had a reason to them, the dragon didn't question it. Leaving the hall their closet was located in, they carefully meandered in the general direction they sensed Ace to be. They were doing great until Luffy silently warned there was a group of people in both corridors ahead of them. But the final prayer that his smoke bombs would work, Sabo quickly shook a can before tossing down one of the halls, grabbed Luffy, then retreated back a few feet to hide in a room. Good news. The makeshift smoke bomb worked. Bad news. It was not the color he'd been hoping for. The smoke was too light, a grayish-white, not the dark gray-black that would have really given the impression something was on fire and would have hidden his and Luffy's forms from sight. Still, the cloud looked to be dense enough to make two boys running through it hard to see. Once the other group in the neighboring hallway ran to see what the commotion was about, the two brothers made a run for it down the newly vacated hall. They didn't have many cans, so Sabo only used them if the situation required it. He had to spend a minute to impress upon Luffy the importance of being stealthy for now. The little dragon just wanted to blow a hole in the side of the ship and be done with it. The bonk on the head and mental rant about how that would just bring more trouble in the form of angry, strong commanders and their captain, plus the 100 or so other pirates, sufficiently scrapped that idea. Luffy quietly cursed as he stumbled now and then, his fatigue starting to grate on his mind and body. Ace and Sabo radiated concern, but he shoved it to the side to focus on his surroundings. Sensing they were finally getting close to Ace, he had to quickly yank Sabo right when he caught the scent of several humans ahead to the left, probably Ace's guards. Unfortunately, the abrupt movement startled a rather loud curse out of Sabo and made him drop one of their last smoke bombs. The pirates guarding the burnt entrance to the infirmary noticed the scuffle and sent some to investigate. Seeing the smoke and their brothers being thrown back towards them, the rest of the group realized they had found the missing captives and went to try their hand at subduing them. The two brothers, not wanting to get penned in and hearing some of the other enemy pirates catching on to what was happening, decided to head up top where there was more room to fight. Ace, you're welcome to leave your room anytime now. I already have, Sabo. Annoyed, could you guys have used any more smoke? I can hardly see where I'm going. The halls were filled with a milky smoke, and Ace was having a difficult time trying to pick out which way to go to get to his younger brothers. Lucky for him, a breeze was flowing through the halls and was pulling the thick haze along with it. Luffy and Sabo also left behind a trail of groaning or unconscious bodies for him to follow. While he'd been sleeping and then lying awake while pretending to sleep, Luffy had shared a few details of what had happened while he'd been out. Ace was upset because the entire time he'd felt Luffy trying to shield him from how exhausted and unstable the younger was. Not wanting to overtax his baby brother, Ace tried to get more concrete impressions of the younger's health from Sabo. A series of impressions and vague images later, Ace came to the conclusion that Luffy was approaching his breaking point. His baby brother needed food, rest, and to shift. Resting and shifting were of more import at the moment, he figured. Luffy would probably be too keyed up to eat until those first two were taken care of, which would only happen if he were with both older brothers and someplace he felt safe. Worry, we've been found. Get here fast. Stay hidden. Ace cursed and sped up after hearing Luffy's warning. His ribs still ached and his head was pounding again, but nothing was going to keep him from protecting the only two people in the world who loved him. They were almost to the exit that lead up above when Luffy felt it. Seeing Sabo tense before kicking a pirate out of the way let him know the older had felt it too. The stronger pirates had caught on to what was happening and had found them. Wanting the pirates above to not search further, Sabo gave the command to stop suppressing their presence. He hoped this would distract those intent on capturing them from noticing Ace was up and about. Seeing as they had a bunch of angry pirates hacking up a lung from the smoke behind them and several ready-to-fight commanders waiting above, Sabo reluctantly gestured from them to take the stairs. Luffy sent a brief message to Ace telling him they'd been found and for him to hurry up before following his brother. Taking the last two smoke bombs, Luffy widened the holes in them at Sabo's direction before both shook the cans hard and tossed them onto the deck. Somehow Sabo still doesn't get how it happened, but somehow things like this seem to be the norm for Luffy. Luffy's can exploded once it touched the deck. The result was a huge thick cloud of smoke from the exploded can and a meandering thick trail from the other due to the ship's constant rocking. Hiding their presence again, the two brothers took advantage of the gathered pirate shock to leave the entryway and try to put some distance between them and the stronger auras. They stayed within the cloud as well as they could, avoiding and knocking out the pirates who came too close. Sabo made sure to keep Luffy within his limited visual range. While they could still sense each other through their mental bond, it wasn't accurate enough to tell them how the other was doing without directing more focus towards it. They could only get small impressions of the other's condition and general location. This would help, but Luffy was too tired and out of sorts to do more than focus on suppression. He could only dimly sense where the stronger presences were at the moment. Sensing where Sabo was would be hard with how much both were suppressing their presences on a normal day and impossible for the younger right now. Keeping mental communication to a minimum, Sabo didn't want to overload Luffy's mind while in such a fragile state, and Luffy was too exhausted to argue. They kept sight of each other and covered one another's backs. When the blonde noticed the smoke starting to dissipate and Ace still hadn't arrived, though he was much closer to them now, Sabo started to worry. He could feel Luffy's exhaustion getting the better of him, the younger stumbling more often and experiencing greater difficulty in dodging the pirates around them. The commanders also hadn't moved from where they stood when Luffy and Sabo first appeared on deck. Concern, worry, unease, careful Lu. The strong ones are up to something. Anger, dislike, agree, maybe. Sabo and Luffy heard breathing to surrounded bound. The images were vague, but Sabo clearly understood what Luffy was trying to imply. He'd come to the same unhappy conclusion. The stronger pirates were waiting for the two to tire themselves out before moving in to catch them. Seeing the last of their hazy cover receding from the wind on deck, Sabo came up with a last-ditch plan. "Lu, if we jumped over the side, do you think you could get us in through one of the gun ports?" Luffy really wanted to say yes, he could easily do that, but doubted he'd be able to make it to the railing unless Sabo carried him. He was at his limit, he was tired, weak, sore, and lacked the strength to make another go. For most of the day Luffy had been running solely on fumes, and now those fumes had finally sputtered and died out. Weakly and slightly ashamed, Luffy conveyed this to his older brother through a light touch on the other's wrist. "Love denial concern, it's fine Lu. I'll think of something else, it's not your fault." Deep down Sabo had grimly expected this answer. Luffy was having trouble just staying upright at this point, only sheer will keeping him on his feet and not lying face down on the deck. There was no way Luffy would be able to make a run for it at this point. All Sabo could do was protect him when the younger did finally go down. Their situation only hooked a curve for the worse as he saw the commanders finally starting to separate and spread out, beginning to box the brothers in. The other weaker pirates noticed as well and moved to clear the way for their leaders. Sabo and Luffy kept wary eyes on their enemy, standing back to back to avoid blind spots. "Worry, no shifting Luffy. Not unless Ace or I say so. Promise." Light growling met this request. "I mean it, Lu. You can't do anything that might give you away. Promise." And I resent unhappy anger dislike. Now Luffy, unhappy tired dislike resign, fine. Promise. No shifting. Luffy hated how tired and weak he felt. He hated being banned from changing and helping protect his brothers even more though. Yeah, he understood it was for his safety, but he still despised not being allowed to reveal himself when it could potentially help his kindness. Even a weak and exhausted dragon can be dangerous. Only reason I give in is because of what could happen to them. Sabo sent a small wave of gratitude, apology and love to his baby brother. He also sent a wordless request demand for Ace to hurry his fiery ass up. The brothers' exchange had only taken a few seconds in the real world. Eyeing the encroaching enemy pirates, the blonde side glanced to his left and gave an internal relieved sigh. There was still a hole in the circle of commanders that hadn't been closed yet. "But you've calmed down a little, perhaps we can talk like civilized people." Stormy blue eyes flicked towards the large, mustachioed man with two large swords hanging from his waist, standing several paces in front of him. Luffy's growls became more audible, reaching the ears of the pirate standing nearest to him. When had he started talking? Sabo shifted his stance into one that gave the impression he was going to continue fighting. He sent a quick image and sense of intent to Luffy and hoped he was coherent enough to understand it. Grabbing Luffy's wrist with his right hand, the younger quieting while tensing his arm and twisting to latch onto Sabo in return, Sabo gave a quick flick of his left to dislodge the small paper pouch he'd hid in his sleeve. Hearing Marco's warning, the commanders focused their attention on the open door, with smoke billowing out it, leading below. Whitebeard takes a watchful stance as he remains furthest from the scene, preferring to wait and watch whatever follows for now. Those that had been trying to clear their lungs and eyes of the foul smoke in the open air readied themselves to confront the escapees once again. At the same time as the chaos-creating duo's presence disappears, two smoking things fly out of the doorway, one exploding after a bounce on the deck and sending the other skittering off to the side. Concentrating on his hockey, Marco is able to dimly make out what he believes to be the older of the pair's presence. The younger, probably due to his current condition, is much easier to track, though still doing a fair job of suppressing their presence. He senses the escaped captives rush the deck and hide within the giant ball of dense smoke sitting before the door. The wind catches and expands the milky gray cloud, giving the top and straw hat wearing boys more room to hide in, while covering the pirates trying to detain them. With observation hockey, the commanders and captain watch the boys fight against their surprised and confused siblings. Vista mentally commends them for using the smoke as a cover and efficiently dealing with those who come too close. Aizu tracks their progress and notices how the two follow along with the milky cloud's wind-driven path, edging closer to the Mobi's side while remaining in the densest parts. Garuda watches on in fascination, wondering where the two managed to even find smoke bombs and where they had been hiding until now. Being a prankster and sometimes stealth spy of the Whitebeard pirates, he thought he'd known of every hiding place on this ship. Yozu and King Du gazed at their groaning and moaning brothers, mentally tallying who needed how many more hours of hand-to-hand and hockey training. Though understanding that, even frustrated and upset, their brothers wanted to catch the troublemakers while inflicting as little harm as possible and were going easy, it was still no excuse for how badly they were underestimating their targets. Cloud clearing, Thatch was able to better watch the pair's movements. His observation hockey, while good, wasn't to the level of Marco's, Pop's or Aizu's, so he wasn't able to get a clear sense of the fighting boys' actions. With the constant wind thinning the thick haze, he could see how the two were fighting and, more importantly, get a better look at their condition. The top hat wearing blonde dressed like a gentleman and straw hat black haired child never strayed beyond arm's reach of each other. If one began to move beyond that distance, then the other would immediately move to compensate for it. While moving about and fighting, the blonde maintained a position that kept him slightly in front of the younger kid. Looking closer at the smallest of the pair, Thatch's lips thinned and eyes darkened at what he saw. Straw Hat was pale and had difficulty making smooth movements, his attacks and evades shaky and semi-uncontrolled. The boy stumbled often, and some of his attempts to attack or dodge fell short, his breaths were heavy and labored, as if he'd been running a marathon. Still the boy fought on, never slacking in defending his comrade's back. If what that kid's crewmate said was true, I'm shocked he even has the ability to do all this with the condition he's in. As the smoke lifted even more, almost completely gone now, Thatch realized that the older teen was not only fighting while leading the younger, but was also covering for the child. Anytime the small raven hair faltered, the other leapt to his defense. A brief nudge or gentle shove when the child stumbled kept him from falling and helped him continue forward. If a hit missed or one of Thatch's siblings got too close, then the older teen would either knock the offender away or pull the kid out of reach and closer to him. Seeing the kids like this, Thatch wondered, how would they fight if they were healthy and fresh? The tap on his shoulder had the fourth looking to his right. Marco subtly motioned for him to get Aizu and the other commander's attention. Looking at his older brother's face, one would think the man bored of the situation, a general expression of laziness written in his features and supported by his casual stance. Thatch, however, saw the concerned light hidden in the blue eyes and the tense jaw that hinted of silent worry. Lightly smacking his geisha-dressed brother's arm, Thatch leaned over to whisper into Aizu's ear, once the other turned his analyzing gaze off the two escapees. Quietly get the other's attention. Aizu shifted away slightly to see his brother's face, question clear in his eyes. Thatch tipped his head towards Marco, who was back to watching the fight. Looking between Marco and the two troublesome brats, understanding dawned on Aizu. He quickly got his brother's notice, indicating they be silent, and pointed to Marco. Seeing how the brats fought his children, how in sync they were with one another, showed they were used to fighting at each other's side. The level of trust they displayed made it obvious this was a natural occurrence for them, something that required no thought to accomplish. He could sense their frustration and desperation as they fought. Saw the determination and resolve to succeed and reach their lost captain. Whitebeard caught his eldest son's gesture for the commanders to discreetly surround the two fighting brats. Though he could easily subdue the pirate brats, the giant captain opted not to. He was impressed by the stubborn will and tenacity the cheeky duo had shown so far while aboard his ship, not at all against the idea of adopting them in addition to Ace. This thought brought back to mind the demand issued by the Spade Pirates, Marco's words, and Thatch's story. Ace's eyes held too much anger and hatred in their grey depths for one so young. He looked weary of the world and scarred by the darkness it held. Hearing that the young captain, despite being fiercely protective of them, kept himself at a distance from those he sailed with, saddened Whitebeard. After meeting the kid face to face, his resolve to make him a part of his family only deepened. He believed the only way to break through the fire user's shell was to isolate the boy from his old crew and have his children integrate the brat into this one. By giving the young captain a new home and people he could see as family, the veteran captain hoped those shadows Ace carried about him would fade. The kidnapping and isolation were only deemed necessary because Whitebeard knew a stubborn, hard-headed brat when he saw one. Many of his current sons and daughters could be described that way. Looking at the straw hat and top hat wearing brats, obviously reaching their limits but choosing to continue fighting anyway, the captain was reminded of Ace. Whitebeard could easily picture the hot-headed youth fighting with these two at his side. In fact, back when he first confronted Ace, these two had stood solidly next to him. Ace's posture at that time had been defensive, protective even, but also less tense, like the two's presence was expected and welcomed. Whitebeard's eyes narrowed faintly as he watched the rambunctious brats. If what he'd heard earlier was true, he was really starting to believe it, regardless of Thatch's story, and these two were removed from Ace's vicinity, then Marco's hunch would very likely turn to reality. In the case that Thatch was somehow correct about these brats' past, Whitebeard would only be causing more pain to fall on them if he kept the boys apart. Decided, Whitebeard kept his distance from the fight and played the part of the observer, for now. The two brats already held him in a negative light for kidnapping their friend and then refusing to return him. Ace disliked him already for some unknown reason. The fiery brat's desire to defeat felt different than others who had come after his head. The youngest probably disliked him even more than the other two, too. He'd been subjected Whitebeard's conqueror's hockey and, weakened, was made to watch that same force down his companion while Ace was taken away. The giant captain didn't want to risk making another negative impact so soon, especially if he wanted the feisty brats to join his family as well. Marco watched as the headache-inducing pair of brats finally took notice of the commander's movements. They immediately spun so that their backs faced each other, the blonde facing Vista and Aizu and the shrimp facing him and Thatch. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Thatch's shoulders tense. Flicking his gaze to the younger Whitebeard pirate, he noted the worry and concern in the Redeed's taut expression, a hint of guilt in his darkened hazel eyes. This close to the smaller brat revealed more about the condition his body was in, and Thatch didn't seem to be taking the reality of the younger's situation too well. Turning his focus back onto the dup before him, Marco raised an eyebrow slightly at the look the little straw-hatted shrimp was giving him. Despite standing on shaky legs that looked about to buckle and send him to the ground, the kid held firm in his position of guarding the older teen's back. Anger and displeasure radiated off the child in thick waves as he shot baleful glares at those who stood before him. The glare he kept directing at Marco, and the one aimed behind him at Pops, were the harshest though. Marco was confused as to why the kid was so much more hostile towards him. Pops he could understand, that was easy. But why him? That's right, Yoi. He saw me take ace from them again. The top-hatted gentleman tilted his head slightly towards the black-haired child just as the younger tensed and started to quietly growl. Marco only heard the sound thanks to his superior hearing. With what the kid has done so far since he came aboard and from what he'd been told, the Phoenix Zone firmly believed the little kid to be a fellow's own type fruit user. He grimaced mentally. An aggressive and stressed carnivore type, even in this kid's state, could do some damage if he loses it Yoi. They would have to focus on getting the smaller of the pair subdued and under control before going for the blonde teen. He didn't want any more of his siblings to require a trip to the infirmary, there were enough as is. Vista took a half step forward, his hands raised with palms out to show he meant no harm. Please, stop. Hopefully, now that you've calmed down a little, perhaps we can talk like civilized people. Marco's fellow commander barely got halfway through the question before the growls emanating from the straw hat child grew louder and deeper. The kid's partner grabbed his wrist and the kid quieted a little, though the feral air surrounding him never abated. Marco only then realized that the growling child was easy to sense, his presence only slightly masked. The other was still hard to lock onto, but the little one was registering to his observation hockey clear as day. It looks like he's going pass out any minute now Yoi. Just as he saw the little straw hat kid loosen up his stance, the blonde teen flicked his arm and smoke quickly engulfed the pair. The commanders were in shock at the sudden development, not expecting the brats to have this last trick up their sleeve, literally. The 1st Division commander was the only one mildly thinking something like this was going to happen. He'd seen the older ex-captive spade pirate shift his head slightly towards where Jozu and Blenheim were trying to move closer together to completely trap the escapees. The younger merely flickered his gaze over the spot before refocusing on the commanders standing in front of him. Transforming his arms into fiery blue and gold wings, Marco took to the air as he shouted, "Don't just stand there Yoi." From the above, the Birdman saw how the older teen was half carrying, half dragging the younger child along as they made a mad dash towards the ship's side. Already they had made it through the gap between Jozu and Blenheim. Do they mean to jump in the damn ocean? The kid will drown before they make it anywhere Yoi. Shaking off their surprise when they heard Marco's shout, the other commanders pursued the boys. Seeing where the targets were headed gave most of them the same idea as the first. The 2 spade pirates were within 10 feet of the rail when the younger one tripped and fell, the older stumbling for a couple paces when the raven was tugged from his grip. The blonde spun around and made to snatch up his friend, a panic-stricken expression marring his face. He'd stopped suppressing his hockey. Marco had the sneaking suspicion that someone had taught these two something of the skill for how well they could hide themselves, so the flying commander could sense the absolute fear and worry emanating from the kid, along with some undercurrents of anger. Vista, Aizu, Thatch, and Marco were the first to react after the 2 small, but effective, distraction, and were closer to the brats than the others. The large dual swordsman passed up the kid on the ground, apparently deciding that the blonde gentleman presented a greater threat than he weak and exhausted wild child. Aizu and Thatch stopped by the currently growling, straw-hatted kid and were trying to pin him down without hurting him. Vista was already having trouble with his quarry, who was managing to keep out of reach while trying to get around the swordsman. The large pirate was acting as a barrier between the 2 kids, moving to keep the top-hatted blonde from getting to his younger comrade. Though doing a fair job of evading the more experienced pirate, both Vista and Marco noticed the teen was slowing down. Still was a pain trying to catch if he judged the small frown on Vista's face right. By now the rest of his brothers had surrounded the 2 groups, those who weren't commanders keeping their distance and staying out of the way. Even if the 2 younger pirates got free of the ones presently trying to subdue them, there was nowhere for them to run. The commanders had totally surrounded them and left no holes to be taken advantage of. Curses moved Marco's gaze from the blonde and Vista to Aizu and Thatch's struggle. The 16th and 4th Division commanders were having their own problems with the wild kid. Marco could see some new bruises forming on the little skin exposed on his brothers. Even completely exhausted and obviously at the end of his rope, the shrimp was still able to give Marco's brothers a hard time. Straw Hat was making haphazard at dodging and evading the two commanders trying to grab at him as he stumbled about on shaky legs, sometimes tripping and having to make a crawling leap to avoid the other's hands. Aizu and Thatch also found themselves on the defensive at times. If they weren't careful in how they tried to grab him, the shrimp would either try to bite a reaching hand or land solid, if somewhat awkward, hit on undefended body parts or extended limbs. The pirate kid glared at anyone his eyes landed on, defiant even in the face of the situation he found himself. Growls from his throat were constant at this point, much louder and deeper than the ones Marco had heard before, though not quite what they were when Pops took ace again. Not yet, at least, yoi. And spiking at odd intervals. It took a moment for the bird's own to realize that the growls spiked whenever Vista almost succeeded in grabbing the kid's partner. Marco furrowed his brows minutely in confusion as he hovered above the scene. He didn't sense the kid using any haki, his actions clearly based on instinct, and he wasn't able to get a clear line of sight to see what was happening to his crewmate. So how does he know when the other is in trouble? Is it a result of his devil fruit yoi? Marco scowled as he continued watching the little raven-head shrimp, noting Aizu and Thatch were also visibly growing more concerned. The kid's breathing was ragged and he was growing paler. Most of the movements were forced and his stumbling and shaking of the limbs more pronounced, body struggling to obey the commands being demanded of it. The leader of the 1st Division was paying more attention to the Straw Hat Kid because of this. If the kid did have zone abilities, the animal whose nature he shared could react violently if he tried to use them right now. Since the kid was so young, it was probable he hadn't had the time and experience needed to master the devil fruit, so losing control of himself when exposed to circumstances such this was a very real danger. When the small pirate had a particularly bad stumble, Thatch and Aizu were finally able to latch onto him. The chef and gunman each grabbed an arm, placed a hand on each shoulder, and tried to gently force the kid to the ground. Tried being the key term. As soon as their hands touched him, the little Straw Hat Kid switched from growling to full-on snarling, struggling violently against the grips holding him. Marco was surprised at the amount of anger and rage emanating from the small body. He frowned when he felt beneath all of that a sense of fear. It was barely there, perhaps the brat trying to hide it or not acknowledging it, but there nonetheless. I thought they knew we weren't out to harm them, just detain. Why is he afraid, yoi? Out of the corner of his eye, Marco saw the kid's accomplice pause. Turning his focus to the other pair, he saw Vista take advantage of the young pirate's distracted state to grab the blonde's arm. Shouting colorful curses at the larger pirate, the team tried to break his hold. Feeling the fight was essentially over, Marco lowered himself to the deck near Thatch. Aizu had left Thatch to deal with the snapping and snarling child they'd managed to force down to the ground to go help Vista with his charge. His pompadour sporting brother had the kid on his stomach, a hand braced between the shoulder blades, the other gripping the kid's forearms and pinning them to the middle of the kid's back. Thatch was kneeling behind and over the kid, one leg pinning the smaller two together on the ground, using his size to keep the small pirate from wriggling around too much. Reaching his sibling's side, he asked, "Need any help, yoi?" Grunting as he tried to get better hold of his squirming captive, Thatch replied, "Thanks for the offer, Birdbrain, but I think oof. I got this handled." Aizu and Vista sound like they're having fun. Marco and Thatch looked over to see Vista and Aizu trying to wrestle the younger pirate into submission. Vista was holding the brat against his chest, one arm pinning the teens in front of him, the other arm wrapped about the torso to keep the teen from moving freely. Poor Aizu was muttering indignantly, arms wrapped around and pinning the teen's writhing legs together as he tried to keep the struggling and cursing young pirate from kicking and getting free. "Can we get some cable or chains over here?" Vista looked to his brothers for help. One of those watching asked, "We got thick rope, why can't we use that?" "Because apparently mere rope wasn't enough the first time and I don't want to go through this mess again," the swordsman answered. Thatch chuckled at hearing this, and Marco silently agreed with his brother. The chef went silent, and Marco noticed him looking down at the kid under him. Lying limp, no longer struggling against his captor, the kid just stared at his friend being held by Marco's brothers. Both men shared looks of confusion and worry, each noticing that the kid's growls had gone silent while they'd been watching Vista and Aizu. Marco couldn't sense anything from the kid's aura. He wasn't hiding his haki, he was too weak for that, it seemed. Even with his strong observation haki, equal if not greater than Pop's, the quiet kid appeared as a blank slate. Wait, what is that? He'd been so focused on trying to read the Straw Hat Pirate that Marco almost missed a scent coming from the limp kid. A scent which was rapidly growing stronger, although he still couldn't sense anything from the younger's haki. He's afraid. Why is he so scared? Sensing something was about to happen, even if the young pirate's haki didn't indicate it, Marco tried to warn his brother. "That's yoi." Too late. The guttural, ferocious snarl burst from the small pirate's throat at the same time he violently bucked his entire body. Thatch, taken completely by surprise, lost his grip. The hand braced between the shoulders slipped on the dusty, red vest to the deck of the shipwright by the kid's head. Immediately, the child twisted his head and viciously bit into the man's arm. Straw Hat growled around the flesh, blood dripping from the wound, as Thatch cried out in pain and reeled back. Freed from being pinned by Thatch's knee-jerk reaction, the kid held on until Thatch had accidentally pulled him to a crouched position. Marco could only watch as the brat let go just as he kicked out behind him with both sandaled feet. The blow connected with Thatch's midsection and sent the commander flying for several feet, landing heavily on his back and gasping for air. It had happened in only a couple bare seconds. Too quick for even Marco to react in time. The Phoenix's own saw Haruta, who'd been standing closest to their group, moved to intercept the violent kid before he get anywhere. The youngest commander, unprepared for the shrimp's sudden agility, was met by a spinning kick that launched the teen directly into a still recovering Thatch. What the hell just happened, Yoi? Snapping out of his shocked stupor, Marco spread his arms turned wings and jumped to stop the now running Ravenhead from reaching Vista and Aizu. He kept his wings splayed out, using them as fiery wall to shield his brothers and prevent the wild kid before him from reaching them. The kid's gaze settling on him felt oddly unnerving, though the straw hat kept him from seeing the small pirate's eyes. Tuning out the shouting and yelling going on around him while trusting his family to watch his back, Marco focused entirely on the straw hat pirate. Though he tried using observation hockey, Marco couldn't read the younger's actions. He had to rely on reaction speed to counter and block. A frown ghosted over his features. The kid still resembled a blank slate, and if he was thinking about his actions, Marco would have been able to use his hockey to read them. Since he couldn't, it meant that the kid was acting on instinct, no conscious thought put forth. After another exchange, Marco's nose was assaulted with that same scent from earlier, almost completely covering the child's own unique scent. Fear. The kid was impossibly afraid. The constant and disturbingly inhuman-sounding growling. The violence being displayed. The sudden enhanced reflexes and agility when he had dropped from exhaustion only minutes prior. The increasing desperation lacing his actions. It was all because of the sheer amount of fear this kid was feeling. He only got this bad after seeing his friend captured. He remembered now what Zack had told him. How only idiots would be stupid enough to try separating the three, and that they were very protective of one another. Obviously, the Whitebeards were witnessing what was meant by those words. We're only exacerbating the situation, Yoi. Vista. Aizu. Slowly come over here, Yoi. Brat, stop squirming, it will only set your friend off. Marco's low steady voice sliced through the commotion. The commander didn't dare to take his eyes off the straw hat wearing kid, his instincts telling him that would only call for an immediate attack. Feeling the presences of his two brothers and their charge moving towards him, the Phoenix tensed as he sensed the Raven's focus shift to land behind him. The deck had gone silent. Everyone watching and waiting to see what happened. He could even sense his father's gaze centered on them. What are you planning, Marco? If the little one makes it to us, this handful will get free and they'll both get away. Again. Hearing Vista's whisper and noting a lack of sound from the blonde in their arms, he was about to ask when the other continued, I have my hand over his mouth, if you were wondering. His threats were authoritative, but I was getting a headache. Keeping a watchful eye on the unpredictable kid still growling a few paces away, Marco turned his head just enough to see the blonde teen out of the corner of his eye. The teen was extremely tense, though he'd gone completely still in Vista's hold. Aizu had stopped holding the young pirate's legs and was standing at Vista's side, prepared to act if anything should happen. Worry shone in the teen's blue eyes as they locked onto the space his friend occupied, hidden by Marco's raised wing. Those same blues met his own lighter pair, apprehension quickly filling them, before flicking back in the direction of the smaller raven-haired pirate. I'm sorry things got to this point, Yoi. Deep blue flashed to center back on him with a guarded expression clouding them. Can you calm your friend down? He doesn't look good and we are worried he'll hurt himself. Seriously, Birdie, what are you doing? The blonde teen darted a look at Aizu, returning back to him after a moment. Keeping his eyes on the two younger pirates, Marco quietly responded, do you not remember what we talked about, Yoi? That straw hat kid is not in any state to be doing what he is, he's becoming too unstable emotionally and physically. His continuing to fight and run about will only serve to harm him further, Yoi. Still, Aizu hissed back, you saw what he did to Haruta and Thatch. If it's because of his fruit ability, like we think, what's to say he won't attack his own friend? Marco filed away the surprised look that briefly appeared on the captive blonde's face, choosing to ignore it for now. He only got violent after seeing you two catch this guy. I can only sense fear coming off the little shrimp now. I'm hoping that, he gazed meaningfully at the captured blonde pirate, you would kindly go and settle your friend down without trying for another escape, Yoi. Vista shrugged in non-committal agreement while Aizu huffed and crossed his arms. The blonde teen stared at Marco for another few moments before he nodded. Marco took this as an acceptance of his proposal. Returning the majority of his attention to growling and upset kid standing in a slightly hunched position before him, Marco slowly lowered his wings. He tilted his head in the barest of nods to signal Vista to start forward with the blonde he held tight in his arms. The commanders, and everyone else for that matter, were so drawn to what the wild, black-haired child would do next, they were completely oblivious to anything else on the ship. This included the fiery teen who had finally managed to haul his sore body up into the light of the afternoon sun. Ace had been trying to hurry his ass up after receiving Sabo's request for help, more like demand. When he was waking up he'd realized his battered body hadn't hurt as much. Luffy, who'd sensed his rise to consciousness, informed him of the bare outline of what happened that morning. This included a side note of, by the way, Sabo gave you some blood so that you wouldn't be useless later, and that Sabo said stay hidden, idiot. His body was bruised to hell and still hurt whenever he tried to move. Walking was an uncomfortable and painful endeavor, but at least the fire user could get about on his own now. It was a far cry better than that morning had been for sure. Dimly recollecting the way up top from the botched escape, Ace had estimated he needed only a few more minutes to get to the stairs leading up. He was growing worried because Luffy's presence in his mind, always so warm, loving and damn accepting of his existence, that it made Ace ache started dimming. Ace had felt Luffy's worsening state since he'd been woken by the younger not too long ago, had felt how tired and drained his baby brother was even then. It had gotten so much worse. The fiery teen sensed the smaller raven growing quieter and quieter, eventually no longer connecting with him. So he almost fell and kissed the wooden floor in surprise when the back of his mind suddenly seemed to explode in pain, desperation and fear. Dread immediately churned in his gut at the scale of the youngest sphere. Sabo, without piggybacking on Luffy's other bond with Ace, couldn't communicate with him beyond sending emotions or fuzzy images impressions. Still, Ace would have known if something had happened to his blonde brother. Right now the younger pirate was fine, though Ace felt a matching sense of worry and dread coming from him. Ace tried to contact the two several times. Luffy didn't seem to be able to hear him, the fear the younger was experiencing drowning and blocking Ace's attempts. Sabo was too distracted by whatever was happening to their little brother to notice that Ace calling out him. When he finally reached the stairs that went up, Ace was in full-on big brother panic mode. Limping up the steps, still hiding his presence like Sabo had commanded, he was hit by how silent the deck was. Silent except for what was obviously their baby brother's angry growling. This only served to worry the older freckled raven more. Luffy only sounded like this close to being completely inhuman and unnatural by any standard when he was about to shift and attack. But he can't shift because Sabo and Ace always made it their priority to hide Luffy and keep him safe, within reason and without taking away too much of his freedom, of course. So what had happened? Ace got his answer upon reaching the top of the stairs and looking out across the deck. All the Whitebeard pirates, and damn Whitebeard himself, were all watching a set of figures standing in the middle of a ring of their crewmates. Ace's heart almost stopped when he first saw the scene. Red soon tinged his vision once he actually processed what was happening. Luffy stood, hunched over and snarling menacingly, facing a blonde pirate with lazy eyes and flaming wings. Were those wings the guy's arms? Behind him stood a lady in a purplish robe thing next to a big guy with a considerable mustache, wearing almost all black clothing with white gloves and a top hat that reminded him of Sabo's. Two swords hung from the man's waist behind his back. It was what, or more accurately who, the swordsman was holding pinned to his chest that had most likely set Lu off. No. Hell no. Nobody is allowed to hurt my brothers. Luffy and Sabo may or may not be hurt physically, probably only having a few bruises between them at most. But Ace had to block his connection with the youngest brother so he could at least think without Lu's screaming clouding his mind. He still felt terrible for doing it though. Lu was terrified and Ace didn't know why. Sabo was right there in front of his baby brother, so what was scaring Luffy so bad he was losing control of himself? Did these bastards threaten Sabo or something? Or did they already do something to his brother? He'd stood at the door leading below, watching his brothers and coming to terms with their situation for only a minute. A slightly louder growl, and he could hear the plea in it under the violence being promised, even if no one other than Sabo did, knocked Ace out of his shock. Rage filled him and the fire user snapped. Flames flared to life, wrapping about his body like a living inferno. Ace practically flew over to his brothers while launching a massive fire fist attack at the one holding Sabo and roaring, "Stay away from them, bastards." The guy with blue wings blocked his attack from reaching the sword guy unfortunately, but at least the dude was surprised enough by Ace's appearance to drop Sabo. Ace landed in a couple feet in front of Luffy, who had quieted down to harsh growls instead of the animalistic snarling from a few moments ago. Sabo scrambled to his feet and raced over to check on their dragon child, not even pausing as he darted a look at the older brother. Ace internally grimaced and sent a feeling of apology to the blonde, only getting a mild acceptance and impression of "at least you're here now so we'll talk about this later." That was not going to be a fun talk. Ace predicted lots of yelling and cursing and pain. His fire created an enemy-free 20-foot radius around them. Tall, raging flames lined the perimeter, and their very heat forced the Whitebeard pirates to draw back even further. The space between the brothers and the flaming wall was doused in fire as well, though not nearly as hot as the edge flames or as tall. The brothers themselves stood amongst a set of flames too. Only these gave off a gentle warmth as they licked at the two younger siblings, enveloping them in a gentle cocoon that acted as a shield from the intense heat and also providing a sense of protection and affection. Ace still had slip-ups with burning things without meaning to, but thanks to long hours, days, weeks, months of training with Luffy, he no longer felt any fear about letting his flames near his precious family. His fires would never hurt Sabo or Luffy. Ace glared through the fire at those surrounding them, letting out growls of his own when some idiot tried to get too close and increasing the intensity of the flames in that area. This was his fire field. A domain of his making and his to manipulate. It took a ton of energy and concentration to keep it up, but hearing Lou's upset growls and Sabo's desperate whispers trying to comfort their littlest brother behind him spurred Ace on. He'd willingly give everything he had, and more if needed, to protect the only ones in this entire godforsaken world who knew what he was and still wholeheartedly loved him. Marco saw the giant ball of fire headed towards them and immediately started cursing himself for not noticing the new presence on deck sooner. Alright, he was rather preoccupied with the snarling shrimp in front of him that looked ready to take advantage of any distraction on his part, but still. He was a damn division commander. First mate of the Whitebeard pirates and arguably the second strongest on this ship, right after the old man. It stung his pride to know that he had been so distracted by the Straw Hat Brat that he hadn't sensed Ace's arrival until the brat launched an attack at them and revealed himself. And honestly, it had to be Ace and not some other idiot dumb enough to directly attack a ship full of Whitebeard pirates. The feel of the fire headed towards Marco, Vista, and Aizu was the same as the hotheads. The bellowing roar echoing with fury was also a huge giveaway. Marco blocked and dispersed a concentrated mass of fire with his wings, flaring his own azure flames to do so. Two rapid thump sounds caught his attention next. The first being Vista accidentally letting go of the young top hat wearing blonde who landed in an awkward half-sitting position. The second came from Ace landing heavily between the Phoenix and the smaller Raven Hair, the team captain's entire body aflame. Standing straight, the team turned his head to look at the small pirate behind him who was loudly growling now instead of the guttural beastly snarls prior to Ace's entrance before turning to face Marco and his two brothers. The freckled teen let out a growl of his own, much more human-like than the kids, but displaying just as much dislike, and then Marco was pushing his brothers away from the fire that suddenly raced out from beneath the teen's feet. An odd movement caught his eye, and Marco looked over to see the younger blonde teen stumbling as he tried to catch and keep his moving forward, racing towards the damn growing blaze. He tried to catch the pirate's armor jacket to stop him because those angry flames were hot. Damn it, the brat was going to be burned to a crisp. The teen dodged Marco's reaching hand and ran straight into the blazing fire. The Phoenix heard Aizu and Vista gasp off to the side of him, as well as a few others who saw and were voiced their shock and disbelief. Ace's fires seemed to calm for a moment before flaring back into a seething frenzy. The fire raced outwards from the three figures, speeding along the ground and forcing away anyone who had been trying to get close to them. Marco looked behind the three younger pirates and saw that Jozu had managed to grab Thatch and Haruta and moved them back from the spreading flames. Once it stopped reaching out, the fire rose upwards almost 10 feet, the heat increasing and making it hard to stand near the edge. Marco took in the new development. The wall of fire made a rough circle around Ace's location, giving him about 20 or so feet on all sides. The zone also noted that, unlike the time back on the island where Ace had just made a huge wall of fire extending an easy 30 feet into the air, this blazing perimeter worked differently. The inside of the circle was completely covered in flames with no brown decking to be seen. Those varied between only being a few inches tall to almost going past Ace's knees. Although Marco couldn't smell any of the ship's deck burning, he did hear some of his siblings curse as they got too close to fire and saw the flames flare in response to the pirates' proximity at those locations. Examining the center of the inferno, Marco was reminded of what Thatch had said about those kids he'd heard about so long ago. Ace could easily pass for being a fiery demon straight from the depths of hell. His eyes were steel embers that felt as if they would burn someone with only a glance. Fire danced and raged over his form, a living cloak that sent out thick tendrils to wave menacingly at his enemies. The orange cowboy hat hung from a cord onto his back, probably indistinguishable from the flames covering Ace. Through the heat's haze, it was hard to tell if the fire user's body was having trouble keeping its human shape, with the hands and parts of the limb dissolving into a flare of fire, or if it was just a mirage conjured by the fire's heat. Marco felt a spike of fear when he noticed that even the two boys behind the young captain were also covered in fire. Looking more closely, it seemed as if the two weren't bothered by the searing fire. A dark air surrounded the three, but they seemed to relax slightly in each other's presence. The Phoenix frowned as he stared at the picture the three made, reinforcing Thatch's words and the title given to these boys by their own crew. Ace and his companions, with the negative and dark emotions that could be felt in their presences, gave the impression of three demons who were at home standing in the midst of a raging inferno. Marco wasn't sure how he felt about that. What kind of life could these three have led to look like that? Shooting a look at his father, he saw that Whitebeard had come to a similar conclusion. The giant man had his eyes narrowed, staring at the three like he looking at a puzzle. A puzzle that had him reaching unpleasant answers or theories as his yellow eyes darkened in concern, worry, and fear for what these boys must have lived through in their short lives. Ops turned and looked between Marco and the boys a couple times before shooting the 1st Division commander a meaningful look. The Phoenix raised a questioning eyebrow in return. His captain gave single nod back before returning to watching the three pirates standing in the field of flames. Once past Ace's barrier, Sabo rushed and dived to kneel before their little brother. Placing his hands on either side of Lu's head and shifting into his field of vision, Sabo made it so that Luffy would only see him and Ace's back. It also prevented anyone else from being able to see the golden eyes, which were usually almost black when the youngest was in his human form, and the slit pupils they showcased. The direct contact of their skin helped the blonde to form a concrete physical bond, as tried to break through to Lu using their mental one. Ace shifted back a little and moved his left hand to rest on the back of Sabo's neck, providing support for both his brothers. Sabo whispered aloud and mentally to his little brother. Trying to soothe him and let him know he wasn't losing his big brothers, they weren't in immediate danger, Ace was right there with them. The blonde pushed every bit of love and comfort he could collect from both him and Ace, along the quivering thread connecting them to Lu. The little dragon only ever became this scared when he was faced with his greatest, and possibly only, fear. Being alone. So Sabo, with Ace supporting him and protecting them, repeated the same message in different forms over and over to their little light. He kept telling Luffy he wasn't alone. It took a few minutes until Sabo blew a quiet and relieved sigh, finally breathing easier as he saw Luffy's slitted pupils widen and the bright gold eyes fade back to near black. Dark orbs focused on the sea blues gazing at him in concern and worry, shifted to land on the back covered in fire in front of the pair, ending with a glazed look at the ground at his feet. The younger's shallow breathing became deeper and the constant growling dwindled to brief bursts. Still shaking and unsteady with exhaustion, Luffy grabbed Sabo's jacket sleeve in one hand, then reached to latch onto one of Ace's with his other, wanting proof that he could physically feel, proving that his treasure was still there. What happened? Ace could feel light tremors running through Luffy's body, the younger squeezing his hand whenever they hit. Luffy couldn't pull together enough to give even a rough outline of what had caused his strong reaction. Ace could only sense a confusing array of relief, fear, exhaustion, terror, anger, and panic. They swirled together in a jumbled mess he couldn't make heads or tails of. I think Lu was so tired and mentally drained that he had a hallucination-induced waking nightmare that resulted in an extreme anxiety attack, Sabo whispered back. Ace's flames were crackling and roaring with heat, so nobody, not even that bird's own guy, would likely be able to hear them even if they didn't quite whisper. Sabo and Ace just didn't want to chance it though. Meaning. Sabo sighed and rubbed a hand up and down the arm of the smaller hand, clenching his blue coat, watching as another tremor worked through the skinny body. It means that Luffy pushed himself too hard and, in his weakened and sleep-deprived state, his mind started shutting down to try and force him to get some sleep. Being Lu, he fought against it and was pretty much half asleep when he saw me captured and didn't see you anywhere at all. The only thing that clearly registered with him was that we were either gone or being taken away, and he panicked. Which means he attacked anyone close to him because he blamed them for taking us, right? Ace frowned hearing Sabo's low confirming hum. His mind was being nudged and rubbed against by Luffy's, similar to how Cat would bump and rub its head against someone when seeking comfort. The fire user, who'd lowered his shields once the younger had calmed and reached out to him, responded in kind. Why is he trembling? I get he's tired and definitely needs to eat, but it's not because of that, is it? Sabo's eyes darkened. No. He needs to sleep and eat, yes, but more than that he is fighting against his need to shift. His body is demanding it, but because he promised not to in front of anyone, he's preventing anything from changing. Anger, this situation we're in isn't helping either. He's also cold. Ace's eyes widened. What do you mean he's cold? He hardly ever gets cold. If anything, he'd be in danger of getting too hot, and that only happened once. Sabo rolled his eyes at his older sibling's apparent stupidity. Lu doesn't have enough energy to regulate his body temperature. He's hardly had anything to eat since you've been gone, and he hasn't really slept either. The stress of not being able to contact you just made everything even worse. His body is running on empty and is starting to shut down. Hearing this, the fire-coating Luffy became much warmer as it tried to externally heat his ailing brother. Tendrils snaked out and wrapped themselves around the smaller teen's form, appearing as if they were trying to hug and comfort the little raven head. Boy. You three. Ace and Sabo shifted their focus to the crackling wall ahead of them as Luffy let out a loud growl. Sensing someone trying to approach his barrier, Ace flared the flames in that section to force the person back. He also increased the heat and had a couple thick tendrils shoot out a few feet and wave about in warning when the pirate didn't step back. Blue fire met the twisting ropes, and Ace scowled. The blue fire touching his flames felt odd. It was preventing Ace's fire from harming the pirate. That was easy enough for him to gather, but left him puzzled over what else he felt through his fire. Sabo, and dimly Luffy, also sensed it through their bond. This weird blue fire was somehow trying to soothe the anger and rage that resided in Ace's flames. An opposing cool to Ace's heat. Sabo stood and moved to stand at Ace's right, gently nudging Luffy to stand between them, while wrapping his left arm around the younger's shoulders. This was their signature pre-battle stance, brothers shoulder to shoulder and ready to face any enemy. Ace on the left. Luffy firmly in the middle. Sabo on the right. It was familiar and comforting, easing some of the brothers' anxiety as they readied themselves for what was likely to be another confrontation. Marco could barely make out the boys moving through the sudden rise of Ace's flames. His own fire leapt to prevent the reaching tentacles of fire that tried to swat at him when he didn't move away. The Phoenix was surprised at the sheer anger and hatred he felt in those glowing orange fires. When the orange started to retract after its failed attempt to harm Blue chased after and caught it, following until the tendrils completely disappeared back into the wall they came from. He tried to emit a sense of calm through his azure fire, in hopes of lessening the hostility he sensed in the teen's blaze. "I want to talk with you three." Orange fire burned hotter and brighter, glowing white in some spots, while also growing thicker and higher. Marco noticed the wall only changed like this where he stood, remaining mostly uniform everywhere else along the perimeter that he could make out. The roaring fire was too high and thick for him to see through it now, so he couldn't tell exactly what was going on in the center of the fiery circle. His observation hockey told him that three were still all together and held an air of hurt, distrust, and anger. The older two were easy enough to sense, but the youngest was barely there, which really worried him. Straw-Hatted looked to be on the verge of a mental breakdown before Ace's entrance, and, though he smelt the fear easing with the freckled raven stood between them, an odd sensation had crept up his spine. Marco's Phoenix had been very unsettled by the younger raven's outburst, telling him it was bad to upset the child. The 1st Division commander still couldn't read anything from the youngest's hockey, and now he couldn't see or smell the brat to get a sense of what his condition was. He could probably fly up and see over the flames, but that would only cause more tension between the Whitebeards and Three Spades. Pops wanted to take in Ace and most likely the other two now when he saw that look in his father's gaze. Trying to circumvent Ace's defensive barrier, the line he had drawn that stated how close the Whitebeards could get without being immediately attacked would only serve to raise tensions further. No. He needed to get the Three's permission to approach, anything else would be taken as a sign of aggression in their position. A mocking grin. "Good luck getting Ace to call you family." Tone sincere and encouraging. Marco paused in his effort to get the upset trio to talk to him. "Why am I remembering that now, Yoi?" He ran over the scene in his head once. Twice. What was he missing? Going through the memory for a third time, the Phoenix recalled what he had missed. His eyes. "I was so distracted by that stupid grin on his little face, I overlooked how the kid stared at me." Marco really wanted to kick himself for that. He was a bird and one of the best at observing small details, yet he somehow managed to forget how the annoying little straw hat kid looked at him when delivering those words. Challenge. The brat was actually challenging the Whitebeards to try and get Ace to join their family. That was why he had been unsettled by the bipolar way he thought the kid delivered that statement. The words were a challenge, a dare. The tone was genuine in the hope that they would take the challenge. Marco didn't doubt that part. The maddening grin that possessed an air of mocking his father's desire to adopt Ace made more sense to Marco now, with the addition of the kid's look that was aimed at him. The Phoenix really wanted to kick himself now for putting it all together. Of course, the brat doubted their ability to succeed in their goal. He and his family had tried to separate the three and expected everything to go according to Pop's plan. The man had admitted it may take a while due to the young captain's feigned hot-headedness and stubborn pride. Sure, they hadn't known at the time, just figuring it was more of the Spade crew's well-known crazy antics. The crew, while not close to Ace, had been known to be very loyal to the teen. But with how the two had fought, and with the younger running pell-mell back and forth all morning while shouting about their stealing Ace, the signs had been broadcasted loud and clear that the original plan was no way in hell going to work. Marco fixed his eyes on the angry wall of fire, trying to think of a way to talk to the brats and get them to remain on the ship. Zack had said they were protective of each other. "I promise I have no intentions of harming you, Yoi." Marco let some of his flame out and had the blue fire gently touch Ace's fiery wall, hoping the other would be able to sense the commander's sincerity in that statement. "Again, I just wish to talk. You don't even have to come out or let down your barrier. I can come to you if that makes you feel better. You can't go in by yourself, Marco. Even with your regenerative powers you can still feel the pain of being burned." Marco turned to see Thatch had made it over to him from the other side of the blaze, Haruta right behind him. "How's your arm, Yoi?" Thatch looked down at the lightly bleeding limb he was cradling against his chest, pressing down on the wound with his opposite hand. "Hurts like hell but getting better. Bleeding is finally slowing down." He looked up at the blonde with a roguish smirk. "Little brat has a sharp set of chompers on him. And Josu's right, kid's got a strong kick for someone so damn small." Marco mad and went back to staring at the firewall. Thatch scowled at his brother. "I'm serious, Marco. Whatever control Ace may have over his fire is fading. On the way over here there were spots where the fire was burning the deck. You go in there and you risk being turned into a cooked blue chicken." Marco felt his eye twitch at the stupid joke Thatch threw in. "Why don't we test his supposed control by tossing you over the wall? Might actually fix your hair, Yoi." Widening his eyes in faux shock and betrayal, Thatch exaggeratedly whined with mock hurt. "Marco, my own dear brother, you would be so cruel as to subject me to such a horrible and painful demise." He grinned before adding on, "Besides, you could use an impromptu haircut more than me. At least I'm not a bird with hair that looks like a bird's nest, get it?" The phoenix glared at the chef. Then smirked as he threw a small bit of azure flame from his hand at his brother's pompadour and watched as his brother fell backwards onto his butt to avoid getting his hair singed. "Idiot, he knows my fire doesn't burn." Ace didn't want to talk to one of the bastards responsible for causing his baby brother's condition. He just wanted off the damn ship and for them to be left alone. The pirate's fire also unnerved him a little. It seemed to be trying to calm the flames at the wall's edge and prevent them from lashing out. There was also that odd feeling that came to him from where the two fires brushed against each other. "Maybe we should." Sabo felt Ace's curiosity at the statement, so he provided an image of the fire parting to let the other fire-wielding pirate through. "No. He is not coming in here." Ace's fire responded to his anger, growing hotter and flicking out at the speaking pirate to try and force the man back again. Thatch scrambled back a bit from the reaching ropes of flame, cursing as one almost touched him. "Got any better ideas?" Marco flared his own fire to push back the orange fires, trying to force him away. He again tried to project a sense of calm and peace into his fire as it butted up against Ace's angry flames. Sabo looked over at his freckled brother. "Ace, you're getting tired. This technique is still too new and requires too much work to maintain for long right now. And you are also using your fire cloak, which takes more than enough concentration to use on its own. You will burn yourself out at this rate, and I will be forced to deal with your dead weight as well." Ace glared at the spot where he felt those odd flames touching his. "I won't let anyone in. What if he tries something once he's in here? He uses weird flames that seem to have some kind of effect on my own. What about Luffy? This standoff is just prolonging his suffering. He needs rest and soon. If not, we'll be forced to give him permission to change in front of all these pirates just to avoid him hurting himself. He can't fly yet and get us out of the shitstorm that would create." The blazing tendrils trying to hit Marco paused for a moment and then retreated back into the wall. The blonde commander noticed that the towering flames wavered, the heat coming from them lessening a tad. Taking the opportunity presented to him, he stretched out his hand towards the writhing flames and had his own reach out to brush against the orange fire again. Trying to see through the flames to where he felt the trio of spade pirates were standing, Marco called out, "I will leave whenever you want me to if you let me in. I promise not to use my flames against you three, Yoi." The wall wavered more. Flames slowly shrinking in size and intensity. Ace turned his head to look Sabo in the eye, feeling the grim resignation the blonde had shared with him about their little brother's plight. He lowered his smoldering gray eyes to rest on Luffy. The little dragon was still firmly wedged between the two, holding Ace's hand tightly in his smaller left one with Sabo's own left arm curled tightly around the back of his shoulders. Ace's gaze softened as he noticed how Luffy was leaning into Sabo's side, head resting firmly against the other's chest, where he could hear Sabo's heart. Their little brother also had his other hand firmly clenching the back of Sabo's blue coat. Lou's hat was firmly on his head, still a little big on him, and tilted down to help shield his eyes from view. When he felt another shudder rack Luffy's body, Ace gave in to Sabo's request with a muttered, "Fine, but I'm torching the bastard's ass if he tries anything." Aizu walked up to stand as close as he could to Marco in the face of the fire's heat. "You think they heard you?" Marco was about to reply when the wall lowered until it was just above his head. He turned to Aizu and asked, "That answer your question, Yoi?" "Thatch is right, you know. You shouldn't go in there alone," the cross-dresser huffed back. Seeing his brother approach the lowered flames, Aizu made to follow after him. The 1st Division commander turned to tell his brother that he'd be fine, but was interrupted by a set of flames shooting out from Ace's barrier. The twin fires raced along the ground and came together behind Marco, rising until their tips were even with his shoulders. Aizu jumped back to avoid being burned by the fire, shooting a concerned glance at Marco. He needn't have bothered. The phoenix had reflexively doused his body in his own azure fire as he thought the streams were going to attack him again. At least his flame saved him from some of the heat being let off by Ace's fire. Looks like they'll only agree if I go in alone, yoi. Aizu shot a disgruntled look at the blonde. Marco made for the wall of fire again, idly noting how the fire surrounding him followed as well, but remained a steady few feet away from him. Walking in the lane outlined by the smaller extensions, he stopped once he reached the firewall. Am I supposed to just walk through it, yoi? Sabo rubbed Luffy's arm, the younger's growling stopped for the moment as he glanced over at Ace. Just let him in already, hothead. Ace growled but relented and collapsed a part of the wall directly in front of the other fire user. Marco let out a relieved breath when he saw the flames die out. He quickly stepped through the hole, not wanting to test the obviously short fuse the young captain had on his temper. The flames inside the barrier pulled away a few paces to give him a fire-free place to stand, leaving behind a few scorch marks in the deck. The glance behind showed that the flames separating him from the rest of his family joined with the rest of the flaming barrier, also cutting off any escape but up from the fire surrounding him. Turning his lazy-eyed gaze forward, he saw that his earlier assessment had been right. Sort of. The three were standing in the middle of a veritable field of pure fire, no space other than where Marco stood being clear of the flames. At first, he thought the wood under the three's feet was devoid of fire, like with him, but a closer look revealed otherwise. Ace and his two companions were literally standing in the raging fire itself. The other fire user was also more part of the flames surrounding the four than just being covered in it like Marco had thought earlier. Ace's body seemed more like a glowing, solid flame. The parts the Phoenix had seen and believed to be randomly shifting into fire was actually Ace's fiery body giving off small flares. The division commander turned his eyes onto the forms of Ace's companions and was startled to see they had fire dancing across their bodies as well. It was similar to how he covered himself in a light coating of his Phoenix's fire, except theirs was much more sporadic. The orange flames were almost like a shifting, ratty blanket, thicker in some places while thinner in others, and constantly moving about them. Small tendrils of flame came out of the fire beneath them to stroke or wrap about the two often too. Marco relaxed his frame to give the impression he didn't mean any harm and started towards them at a slow gait. The heat is almost suffocating in here, yoi. His eyes narrowed as he examined the flames covering the blonde and smaller raven head. Do those protect them from the heat like mine? Luffy dimly sensed his brother's tension, the energy to find out what had upset them. He weakly prodded at their minds to ask what had happened. Sabo tried to tell him, but all Luffy got was that someone had entered Ace's protective fire. Why had they come in? How? Wanting to see who this intruder was, Luffy turned his head to look in the direction where he felt Ace and Sabo's focus lay. Ace was concentrating so hard on controlling his fire and keeping it from burning the ship they stood on or the pirate belonging to this crew of bastards that wished to speak to them that he didn't notice how Lou stiffened upon seeing who their guest was. Sabo had, so he wasn't as startled when their little brother began to growl. The only warning Marco had was the threatening growl. Ace's fire surged towards him, growing high as his shoulders and intent on burning him to ash. Marco's own blue flames instinctively reacted to the threat. Projecting a stronger sense of calm, he let the azure fire push against the orange without overpowering it. His Phoenix wanted out to meet the threat, but he held it back. Transforming would be seen as a hostile act and would wreck any chance of getting a peaceful talk with the boys. Blue hazily detected his brother's reactions to his implied threat. Sabo was gripping his shoulder tighter and preparing to attack the intruder if Luffy sensed any ill intent from him. Ace had immediately commanded the flames to converge on the human, keeping him from coming any closer and to remain still. Both were waiting for Lou's final opinion on whether to let the human continue or try and expel the person from their vicinity. The Phoenix's own pulled his flames back from pushing against the orange fire once it had stopped coming towards him. It still gave off incredible heat, which would have severely burned any normal person, but didn't invade the small space between orange and blue. Marco had the impression that the flames were mostly to keep him from going anywhere, only attacking if he did anything that could be taken as a threat. Remaining perfectly still, Marco looked over at the three pirates standing side by side about 15 feet away. The older two pirates had the youngest station between them, Ace on the left and the blonde on the right. Ace was glowing and radiating more heat than before, his hands white hot now. Sabo shifted to put the smaller raven closer to Ace, while he adopted a stance that screamed of his willingness to dart across the expanse of fire to attack Marco. Both were alternating glaring daggers at him and sending questioning looks to the kid standing snugly between them. He was a little surprised to see that, without any apparent cues, Sabo and Ace never took their eye off Marco at the same time. One always had a visual fix on him. For whatever insane reason, Luffy gave your crew permission to try and recruit our captain. That is the only reason I'm even talking to you and not letting the idiots outside turn you into a chicken entree for those three crazy monsters. The Spade Pirates see Luffy as a captain because the two actual captains held him in high regard. Marco looked over the trio of young pirates, taking extra notice of the way the older two were glancing at the smaller growling one. If I want a chance at talking with a monster trio, I guess I need the okay of the little kid, yoi. Luffy, mind locked in a haze of exhaustion, continued growling. He knew this human. This was the one who had taken Ace away from him and Sabo. He pulled his lips back to better expose his slightly sharpened teeth and then increased the volume of his growls. This was the one who had tried to keep him from getting to Sabo. Marco felt his chances slipping away as he watched the kid become more openly hostile to his presence. The two captains responded in kind, Ace inching the flames closer and Sabo crouching a little, ready to jump and attack or defend on Luffy's say-so. Not wanting to call it quits just yet, he slowly raised hands with the palms facing the teens, Luffy growling louder at the movement. With sky blue eyes focusing completely on the youngest captain, Marco took a calming breath and called out, "I'm serious, yoi. I only want to talk, nothing else." Ace and Sabo noticed Luffy's growls quieting, fuzzy memories breaking through the fog of the younger's mind. He blearily remembered the reason this human gave him for its crew's crime of stealing his treasure. He stopped baring his teeth as another memory gradually surfaced. When Sabo had been taken, this human had seemed to realize why Luffy was upset and tried to get the other humans to give Sabo back. Marco waited, hands still up by his shoulders in a sign of surrender, as Straw Hat finally stopped growling. A considering frown pulling at Luffy's lips, the small pirate stared at him. Sabo felt a brief pang of relief when Luffy turned away from the tall pirate with blue flames and gently nuzzled his head against the blonde's chest. Ace called back the flames and widened the circle surrounding Marco. As the commander started forward again, Sabo noted that the stronger man was keeping up his air submission in peace. He'd only lowered his hands a little, but still kept them palm out and open. Probably the only reason Luffy is letting him close right now. Sabo had gotten vague impressions from his tired brother, but nothing he could clearly discern. Ace and Sabo knew that even as tired as Luffy was, he would still try to attack the commander if the man did anything that further upset the dragon. The two brothers were just thankful that Luffy recognized the positioning of the guy's hands as one of submission. It would be better if the pirate wasn't staring at them and looked at the ground instead as he approached, but it was fine for now. When Marco came within about 10 feet of the brothers, Ace flared the flames directly in front of the man in warning. Taking the hint, the commander stopped where he was and lowered his hands. "Thanks for letting me in, yoi." The two older brothers glared at the pirate. Luffy tilted his head to fix an eye on the birdman, but still kept his face smooshed against Sabo's chest. "Just say whatever it is and leave," Ace growled. "Be nice, Ace." Sabo sighed, glanced at his older brother before returning his focus to the commander. "He can fly. He could have easily gone over your wall, but instead asked for permission. And careful, you're starting to burn the wood." "Anger, I don't like him. His blue fire is weird too. Let's just see what he wants. Lou isn't completely against it and has said that this person is good." Marco watched as Ace looked over at the blonde, then down at the little shrimp. The younger captain's steel eyes seemed to soften when they caught the shiver that ran through the smaller raven. When Ace turned his angry gaze back onto the commander, Marco saw more tendrils of orange fire arch up and wrap about the straw-hatted kid's frame. "My captain is sorry things came to this. It was never his intent for things to go as far as they did. He also wishes to speak with you three, yoi." Despite his face not changing, Ace's growing temper showed through the heat and increased intensity of his flames. Luffy, gripping his hand tighter while burrowing a little more into Sabo's side, calmed him some. "I don't believe right now is a good time," Sabo replied stiffly, pulling Luffy a little closer to him. Marco noticed the movement. Glancing at the two captains briefly, he looked down at the child between them and asked, "How's he doing, yoi?" Seeing the older two stiffen, he added, "It's just that he didn't look very good earlier, and many of us, Pops included, are worried about him." While Ace remained tense, Sabo loosened his stance and rubbed Lou's arm gently. "He'll be fine with some sleep and food. Since it's getting late, you are welcome to stay here and rest, yoi. We have a few rooms." Luffy's growling cut the commander off. Ace and Sabo tightened their grip on Luffy, sending mental assurances that they wouldn't be split up again. Marco raised his hands to placate the glares boring into him. "We have no intention of splitting you guys up again. Promise, yoi." He waited until the growling stopped to continue. "It's just that, other than the ship's infirmary, there aren't many rooms that can fit 3 beds. We can sleep on our own ship once you bastards let us go." Marco raised an eyebrow at the hothead. "Your ship will take a little while to get to us, and your friend here looks about ready to fall asleep any moment, yoi. We also have a better infirmary and set of doctors and nurses that can look a little one over." Luffy stiffened at that last bit, letting out a small growl to voice his displeasure. "You, Ace." Both fire users turned towards the blonde. "Look at Luffy. He needs to rest. Now." Ace scowled but silently agreed with his brother. Luffy looked terrible and him being difficult was just making things harder on his baby brother. Marco merely watched as the two co-captains seemed to communicate something silently before him. He returned his attention to the conversation when the blonde captain began to address him. We thank you for your crew's desire to check on Luffy's health, but I'm afraid we'll have to decline. He isn't overly fond of being touched by people he doesn't know and is more likely to bite anyone who gets too close to him right now. Marco didn't want to admit that the blonde's polite tone and smile sent a mild shiver down his spine. He figured it was probably because the other's eyes were a complete counterpoint to Ace's. While Ace had eyes that burned like molten steel in their fury, Sabo's were dark seas and absolutely glacial. And their crew is more scared of angering the little shrimp. This doesn't feel like the true face of their anger. How can the little wild one top them at their angriest yoi? As for the rooms, think we'll accept that offer. You don't have to worry about fitting 3 beds into one either. 1 bed and some extra blankets and pillows would be fine for us. Sabo looked down at Lu, a contemplating look on his face. Rubbing the younger's shoulders, he looked back up at the commander and smiled as he said, "And, it would be greatly appreciated if the room is a little spacious. Luffy sometimes gets a little claustrophobic when he's stressed. The extra space will help calm him down enough to sleep." Giving a slow nod, the 1st Division commander wondered at that last part. Something wasn't completely adding up. The statement sounded more like an excuse with bits of truth in it. A firmer nod to show his agreement to the request had the 2 young captains relaxing their tense shoulders. However, the 3 immediately fixed wary and distrustful eyes on the commander. "Our head nurse, Bay, would probably like to take a look at you, Ace. Make sure you haven't worsened or opened any of your wounds, yoi." Ace scoffed at the older pirate. Marco saw a dark look quickly pass over all 3 boys as Ace responded, "I'll be fine. Been through worse and survived, so this is nothing. I don't need your crappy nurses checking me over." "Fine, yoi." Marco looked at the expanse of flames surrounding them, noting that the smell of wood burning was a little stronger than before. "Since we've come to an agreement," he turned back to Ace, "would you mind dropping the flames? They're starting to cause damage, and it looks like this technique is very tiring for you, yoi." Ace was about to argue, but Sabo was quick to cut him off. "Not now, Ace. Just do as the guy says and drop your fire field. You can keep the fire around us going if you want, but this technique is getting to be too much for you." Crossing his arms, switching Lu's hand to his left, Ace grumpily complied with Marco's request. Watching the flames slowly fade from around them, Marco's attention was drawn back to the boys when he heard Sabo clear his throat. "Yes, yoi." The commander saw the flames pause in their retreat. Sabo glanced at his brothers before fixing his sea blue eyes on the commander's lighter ones. "We'd also appreciate it if just you led us to our room." Folding his arms, Marco swept an assessing look over the 3 spade pirates. "Why only me, yoi?" He had to admit, if this was them trying a last-ditch attempt to escape, it was a pretty desperate one. "We aren't planning anything." Marco raised an eyebrow at the blonde, indicating he was listening and waiting for Sabo to continue. Lu can't be around a lot of people right now without becoming even more tense and stressed. Plus, a twitchy Luffy makes for a very flame-happy Ace. Ace let a dark grin slide onto his face. "The less people around the better. Unless you don't mind sending a few new crew members to the infirmary for getting torched, that is." Marco studied the blonde captain's face. A glance at the grin Ace bore and how he was firmly holding the youngest pirate's hand in his fiery grip seemed to confirm Sabo's words. He is completely serious, yoi. He fought the urge to sigh as he thought, and Pops wants to take in all 3 of these brats. Sabo and Ace watched the older pirate contemplate what Sabo told him. What if he doesn't listen? For all we know, he could have us escorted to the brig. "Knock it off, Ace. We'll make him listen. And if he doesn't, well, at least he'll see we weren't lying about what will happen." Ace just snorted when he heard that. Hearing the snort, Marco returned his attention to the 2 pirates. Keeping up a lazy expression on his face, the commander covertly analyzed the 3 teens. He'd noticed something odd about them since the conversation began. Putting his theories to the side, he asked them, "And why is Luffy?" Sabo nodded to confirm he was correct about the name. "Why is Luffy, I guess, with me? Wouldn't it be fine so long as there was only one person escorting you, yoi?" Ace glanced at Sabo as he felt his younger brother's indecision. He was unsure as well. Lu was great at reading people, telling them who was good and who was bad. But he was so tired Ace was concerned he might have not gotten a clear read on the guy with weird blonde hair. Seriously, did someone pull a joke on the guy when they did his hair? Past experience has made Luffy look at others more deeply when trying to assess them, and also forced on the 3 brothers a new motto. Good people can do bad things, and bad people can do good things. Essentially, take everything with some salt. Lu can read people like Sabo does books and is never wrong, but his ability works best the longer he is around someone. The nudge against both their minds drew Sabo and Ace's eyes down to Lu. Marco simply watches as Sabo seems to think over his answer, glancing at his slightly taller co-captain, as if seeking approval for something. Both look down at the younger Luffy. "At least I have 2 names confirmed now. Crew must be telling the truth about them, which means the blonde one is actually Sabo." who turns to gaze up at first Sabo and then Ace, before laying his head back on Sabo's chest with his face partially hidden by the straw hat on his head. Getting Luffy's assurance about the Birdman, Sabo and Ace turned their attention back on the commander. Ace decided to speak instead of his brother this time. "I don't know why, but Lou seems to think you're okay." Sabo shot Ace a look saying he was unimpressed with his older brother. Ace just shrugged his shoulders. "He said that I was okay." Sabo and Ace nod. "What does that mean, Yoi?" Seeing Ace about to open his mouth and sensing his brother's foul mood worsening, Sabo quickly told the other to shut up. Turning to the obviously confused commander, Sabo explained, "Luffy is good at judging people. Since he already told us you were a good person, it means that we can trust you, to a certain extent at least. We don't know about anyone else though, and Luffy won't let others near him with how he is right now." Marco glanced between the two, mildly incredulous at this odd answer. "So what you're saying is, because he," pointing a finger at the small straw-hatted kid, Marco shoots the other two a look of slight disbelief, says I am good Yoi, it means he, and also you too, trust me enough to get close to you guys. Both teens nod, looking for all the world like this makes complete sense, and Marco is some kind of idiot. And I'm guessing that because of how he is now neither of you two will let anyone else close enough for him to judge them. Right Yoi? Again, both young captains nod their heads. Marco, bracing one hand on his hip, closes his eyes and pinches the bridge of his nose while quietly muttering, "Of course it is. Fine, I'll take you to your room. Just let me speak to a few people, Yoi." Hearing Marco's agreement, Ace completed the extinguishing of his field and also dropped his cloak. Ace still kept a small ring of fire around him and his little brothers though, just in case someone tried to rush them. Marco, seeing his brothers and fellow commanders about to try and rush in to confront the four, quickly motioned for them to stay back. From how the two captains were glaring around at his siblings, he had no doubt Ace would be more than happy to light up those who got too close to them. After glancing around, he made a beeline for Whitebeard to let him know what had been decided. "So what did you learn about our guests, Marco?" "We most definitely can't adopt Ace without the other two, Yoi." Whitebeard laughed at hearing Marco's tone. The two, along with Aizu, Thatch, and Vista, were in Whitebeard's room. The other commanders were directing cleanup of the deck. Ace's fire had left scorch and burn marks in several places, and keeping an eye on the unhappy trio. Whitebeard had seen the look on Marco's face and called for the other three commanders to speak privately about what he had discovered. "It's great you weren't turned into a chicken dinner." Marco's eye twitched at the stupid joke he wasn't in the mood for, "but what took you so long? You were in there forever and we had no idea of what was going on, except that Ace's great barrier of flame would flare and act out every now and then. Quit being so dramatic you idiot, he wasn't in there that long. Please stop you two. Let's hear what our brother has to say." Vista cut in. Crossing his arms and sporting a troubled face, Marco answered, "A lot and nothing." "What does that mean?" "Ow. What was that for, Aizu?" "Shut up, Thatch, or I'll hit you again." "You were saying Marco?" "First, their crew was telling the truth about their names after all, Yoi. Ace is the one captain, Luffy is the youngest, and I guess the other captain would be called Sabo. The three never actually said the blonde's name or gave it, but if the crew told the truth, then he would be Sabo. I didn't actually talk with them for long, not at all with the youngest, Luffy. He's sort of part of the reason I was in there so long, Yoi. As soon as he saw me, the shrimp started growling and Ace wouldn't let me go anywhere. Figured if I flew or tried to fight against them, then we'd lose any chance at getting them to talk, so I waited. Luffy eventually stopped growling and went back to being silent, Yoi. He watched me, don't think he took his eyes off me, except for once the entire time I was in there, but never said a word. Before that, what did they tell you directly, son?" Marco flicked his eyes up at his father. "They agreed to staying in a room we provide so Luffy can rest, Yoi." "One room? Do we have any rooms besides the infirmary where we can fit 3 beds? Marco felt the corners of his mouth pull into a slight smile at Vista's question. Apparently, they only need 1 bed and some extra pillows and blankets. Sabo also asked for a slightly larger room because the youngest gets somewhat claustrophobic when he's stressed. Marco turned to look up at Whitebeard. "Can we put them in one of the larger guest rooms, Yoi?" "That is fine. I am assuming the idea of 3 separate rooms was never going to work." Flat out denied the possibility of splitting up once they thought I was hinting at that. "That was probably one of the times Ace's firewall acted out, Yoi." Ace denied the offer of staying on board to rest and was adamant about leaving at first. Sabo talked him down using Luffy's bad health and got Ace to grudgingly agree in the end. "That's right. How seriously, Aizu, stop it. How is the little kid? How is he doing? Did you tell them they should go see Bay?" Marco shook his head. "Wouldn't hear of it, Yoi. Kid stiffened up as soon as I mentioned the idea of going to the infirmary and the other two refused to even consider it. Said Luffy wouldn't let anyone near him with the state he's in either, Yoi. He thought back to the look that had come over all three pirates after asking about Ace at least going. Whitebeard, seeing Marco's expression and sensing his unease, asked, "What else did they say?" Looking up at his father, reading the concern he found there, Marco answered, "Nothing good, Yoi." He glanced around at his brothers before continuing with, "I said that Ace should get checked out, make sure he didn't worsen any of his injuries." Brat just scoffed and said he'd be fine, Yoi. All three suddenly had this heavy feeling around them when Ace added that he had been injured much worse and survived. Everyone's expressions darkened at hearing this. Whitebeard was wondering if some, or possibly most, of the anger and darkness he sensed in the young captain, Aka's soon-to-be son, was a result of what had befallen the three youngsters. To hear that all three had experienced something unpleasant in their past left a bad taste in his mouth. There was one other thing they mentioned, Yoi. All eyes focused on the 1st Division commander. When they are taken to their room, they want only me to be their escort. No one else is to come with Yoi. Do those brats want to try and make one last escape? Jump you or something when you're alone with them? Let's not be so hasty, Aizu. I am sure they weren't thinking of something like that. For one, the smallest is too sick to move about judging from what I saw earlier. He looked about ready to collapse. For another, with one of the others carrying him, it would be harder for them to fight or escape. You're right, Vista. Oh, that's Yoi. The fourth looked at his brother curiously. I want to test something out. Are you planning on making dinner soon? Be when we're done with this. He gave a guarded look as he asked warily, why? Is this about last week with the feathers? Because that was totally heard. Oh, so you were the one who turned the 1st Division into colorful bird people. I said it wasn't me, Vista. Not now, my sons. Marco, continue please. Turning from glaring at Thatch to face Whitebeard, Marco cleared his face and nodded. Right, Yoi. As I said, they only want me to accompany them. The reason Sabo and Ace gave me was that they trusted me a little and completely distrust everyone else. How does that work? As I recall, that little wild child hated you as much as he hated Thatch. The blonde, Sabo, wasn't very happy with any of us either. He even tried for a couple of cheap and dirty hits on Vista and I. Let's not forget how our soon-to-be hot-headed brother came storming out. Those were some of my concerns too, Yoi. What the two spade captains told me was that Luffy had said I was a good person, which somehow translated to mean they could trust me to some extent. A confused silence met this statement. Thatch decided to be the one to ask the question everyone else was thinking. I'm sorry, but what did the little birdies tell the big blue birdie? Thatch. One more stupid joke from you today and I swear I will help Marco restyle you to a nice bald look. Did they mention why the little one thought you were a good person, Marco? Eventually, yes, Yoi. They were a little uneasy about doing so, though, and I think they only told me half what the truth is. Sabo said that Luffy is good at judging people. Since he believed me to be good, Luffy let me come close to them without too much fuss, Yoi. If anyone else does while Luffy is like this, the older two will attack to keep him away. And you want your brother, Thatch, to come with you because. Marco glanced at Thatch before turning his head to face his father. Ace and Sabo seem to believe that Luffy won't allow anyone else close enough to be able to judge them, Yoi. I want to test how truthful they're being. Whitebeard nodded as okay, ignoring Thatch's grumbling. Refocusing on his eldest son, he asked his other pressing question. Did they happen to say how they were related to each other? Marco shook his head. No, they didn't, Yoi. He paused for a couple seconds, trying to think of how best to describe what he'd seen to his father and brothers. Based on what I saw, how they acted, it is obvious that they have been together a long time. Thatch, you said that those kids in your story were called the Demon Trio, right, Yoi? Thatch nodded at his brother, urging him to go on. When I stepped through Ace's barrier, I couldn't help but think that name fit them. They stood in the middle of a field of fire, with flames wrapped around each of them. They definitely had the look of being a set of so-called demons, Yoi. Aizu took in the troubled expression on his blonde brother's face. What's wrong, Marco? He turned to look at each of his brothers. Trying again, the Phoenix said, they looked like they were prepared and expecting to face the entire world. Like they only had each other, Yoi. The way they stood and talked was as if they believed they couldn't trust anyone but each other. Whitebeard frowned at hearing this. He'd wanted to isolate Ace to force the kid into coming out of his shell of darkness and hatred. If Marco was right about what the way these three boys looked at the world, then Ace and the other two were already almost completely isolated from everything. It seems that him trying to take Ace alone had only served to strip the angry teen of the only comfort he had. Their intel had told them that Ace was a loner, but that clearly wasn't the case, seeing the truth being revealed to them over the past day. Sorry, Pops, but I need to get going, Yoi. Ace and Sabo made it clear they were more than happy to light anyone who comes too close on fire, and some of our crew are a little too curious for their own good. I'll see if I can find out anything else from them and report back later. Heading for the door, Marco called out, let's go, Thatch, Yoi. Huh? Wait, Marco, didn't you just say that they said they were going to barbecue anyone who got close? I'm not fireproof like you, Mr. Blue Chicken. Marco. Marco, Thatch and Toe approached the scene with an air of exasperation mixed in with his normally bored expression. Ace, now wearing his bold orange hat, had Luffy on his back, the smaller pirate resting his head on the teen's right shoulder and hiding his face in Ace's neck. Luffy's arms were tucked between his chest and Big Brother's back, hands gripping onto the yellow shirt. The kid's straw hat was hanging down on his back from a thin cord. Sabo stood to the two's right, slightly behind Ace, with his hand rubbing comforting circles on Luffy's back. Seeing Ace's flames wrapping around the other two, despite Marco's warning him about it, still shocked Thatch. A couple strands of fire extended across the small space between the two co-captains to circle around Sabo's chest and shoulders. Luffy, on the other hand, was covered in them. To Thatch and Marco it was as if somebody had wrapped the shrimp in a thin blanket of flame. The top-hatted blonde and straw-hatted Raven also seemed completely comfortable with the idea, like this was completely normal. That might actually be true for these three, yoi. Ace's ring of fire, flames only rising a foot off the ground this time, had expanded from only a few feet when Marco left to talk to Pops to almost 8 in diameter. Luffy was growling non-stop, although much quieter and sounding extremely tired, with both older spade captains shooting dark looks at the pirates around them. Said pirates were grouped around the trio. They must have been much closer at some point because several were looking singed and others were holding their butts or heads. Marco directed the milling crowd of siblings to get back to work and to leave their guests alone. Thatch just kept glancing at the damage caused by Ace's fire, to the teen in question, then back to his handiwork in mild concern and apprehension. Marco wants me to get close to them while Ace does that. What if he sets my precious hair on fire? The Phoenix waited until his brothers had dispersed and Luffy stopped growling before approaching the three. Thatch stayed back, curious as he was about the three, and worried about the small one on Ace's back. He didn't want to risk being burned by the touchy trio. It was safer to wait for Marco to say whether he could come over or not. Drawing close to the edge of Ace's fire, Marco asked, was all that really necessary, yoi? Ace scowled and looked away from the man, only to land on the form standing several feet behind the commander. There was a yellow piece of cloth tied around one of the man's arms where his white shirt was torn and bloody. Bastard's probably one of those who upset Lou and got too close. His scowl deepened and he tightened his hands clasped together behind his back, squeezing Luffy's thighs closer to Ace's body. Sabo also noticed the new person, recognizing him as the one Luffy had bitten. Still staring at the pompadour man, Sabo answered lightly, they upset Luffy. We told them to get back and when they didn't listen to our first warning, we simply gave them some incentive. Hewitt. Marco looked at each of the boys for a couple seconds before trying to introduce the 4th Division commander. Before we go to your room, I wanted to introduce someone to you, yoi. Luffy finally realized that someone else was near the brothers, the changing breeze wafting over the scent of fresh blood. He frowned against Ace's neck as he tried to recall why this blood smelled familiar. A hazy memory of hands trying to pin him down drifted across his thoughts. Thatch had only taken 2 steps before he saw the small raven-haired kid move to look at him. About to take a 3rd step, Luffy lifted his head from Ace's shoulder as recognition seeped into the tired dark orbs and promptly started growling. Again. The chef stopped his advance, worried about aggravating the sickly child and that the now tense and glaring older teens would attack him. I am going to prank Marco so bad if this goes south and I lose my hair. Thatch shot a glare at the stupid fire chicken studying the 3 younger pirates. The blonde commander threw him a veiled look of just do it already yoi. Stupid bird and his stupid ideas. Marco watched his brother slowly raise his hands to shoulder height with the palms splayed out facing the teens. Shooting alas this better work or you're going to regret it. Look at the Phoenix zone. Thatch turned his gaze to focus on the wood planks at his feet. Luffy's growling continued for several heartbeats before gradually stopping. Ace and Sabo were extremely suspicious and wary of the 2 commanders now. Sabo felt that it was the taller man with weird hair who had given the white-clothed pirate instructions of how to act. Ace was tensed and ready to summon some fire to torch the large man. Luffy was quiet now, but both brothers felt how tense and nervous he was, vague impressions of being held down coming across the mental link to them. The 1st Division commander surreptitiously watched the trio, noting the odd way Ace and Sabo stiffened and looked at the ascot tied to Thatch's arm in sync. Luffy lowered his head back down to rest on the warm shoulder, eyeing both commanders. Hearing no more growls and darting a look at the uneasy pirate trio, Thatch took a slow step forward and paused. The wild kid was watching and tracking every move the 4th Division commander made, though it was obvious the brat was on the verge of passing out. Seeing no sign of rejection, ignoring the unhappy and suspicious eyes of the older 2 teens boring into Thatch and Marco, the chef walked at a slow and casual pace over to the 4. When Luffy began showing signs of nervousness and threw glances at Marco, Thatch slowed down some more, while lowering his eyes and raising his hands a little higher. Moving his injured arm hurt, but he was willing to suffer some discomfort if it helped keep the small one from becoming more upset. Luffy and his brothers watched as the injured man drew even with Marco on the other side of Ace's ring of fire. Ace shifted his brother to get a better and more comfortable hold of him, making it easier for the younger to rest his head and still keep an eye on the two enemy pirates. Sabo watched a broader pirate shoot an anxious glance at Marco, lowering his hands to his side after the brothers made no move against them. This is 4th Division Commander Thatch. He's also the head chef on this ship, Yoi. Luffy kept staring at Thatch. Ace and Sabo glanced from one commander to the other with obvious wariness, a guarded look on their faces. "I'm guessing you're one of the bastards who made Luffy so upset," Ace said, aiming a knowing look at Thatch's injury while he glared at the larger pirate. Before Thatch could reply to Ace's comment, Sabo warily asked Marco, "What happened to our earlier agreement?" Thatch glanced between the 4 pirates. Marco looked to be trying to think of something, but was also making very discreet glances at the Straw Hat Kid. The captain pair were obviously on edge, not that he could blame them. It was understandable they'd be distrusting of those who'd held them captive, and their younger comrade was still staring at him. Sabo noticed the tiny shifts Marco's eye made. They were subtle, but Sabo was used to reading other people's body language and movements. It unnerved him that the focus of Marco's attention was his little brother. Lu said this was a good person, and the man didn't seem to have any hostile intent, so Sabo held off on alerting Ace. Ace glowered at the 2 commanders. Taking a step back, he growled, "Face it, Sabo. He lied. Bastard just wanted us to let our guard down." When Ace went to say more, Luffy flexed his hands, tightening their grip on Ace's shirt while keeping his eyes locked onto the one he'd bitten. Ace let out a huff but went quiet. With an anxious expression and wanting to explain his presence himself, Thatch took a hasty step forward. Marco stiffened at his brother's sudden movement, knowing that it could botch his chances of getting more information out of the 3 spades. He was already testing their shaky trust with Thatch's presence alone. Thankfully, Thatch caught himself before Ace could roast him after flaring the ring's flames. Raising his hands again in an effort to show he meant no harm, Thatch cried, sorry. Didn't mean to startle you guys, honest." He winced at the reaction of the 3 boys. Luffy was growling again, and the other 2 had taken more defensive positions, completely on guard and glaring at the 2 Whitebeards. "I just wanted to say that Marco here brought me to help." Marco looked askance at his brother, then back ahead to see the trio's reaction. Luffy stopped growling. He looked from Marco to Thatch a couple times before settling down, relaxing more against Ace while continuing his tired observation. Thatch took this, and the other 2's silence, as a sign that he could continue. "Since I'm a chef, it's my job to feed people, yeah? With all this running around and excitement, we figured you guys might be hungry and want something to eat. I was also to be used as an extra set of hands to help carry some blankets and pillows that you asked for." Marco nodded to confirm Thatch's story. It wasn't the complete truth, but definitely part of the reason he'd asked for the man to come with him. Sabo looked at the 2 commanders warily. The 2 captains doubted that was they were being given the whole reason for Thatch's presence. The Firebird was up to something, but the brothers were too tired and drained at the moment to clearly decipher the man's motives. Sabo nudged at Ace. "What do you think? Should we trust them?" Ace switched from glaring at the commanders to giving a concerned look at Luffy. "Obviously not. But Lu needs to sleep and shift right. I hate it, but we have no choice but go along with them for now. Go. Trust okay. Bird glowing with blue fire. Good." After sharing that with his brothers, Luffy tucked his face back into the crook of Ace's neck. Sabo glanced at his baby brother, then looked over at the commanders. "Fine. None of us are hungry now, but perhaps we'll take you up on that offer later. For now, we would prefer to get Luffy somewhere he can rest." Thatch was visibly dejected at the other's refusal. Knowing Luffy hadn't been eating well and now being told he couldn't do his job as a chef and feed the kid stung. Distracted, he didn't notice how Marco narrowed his eyes at the corners while giving the brothers a searching look. "Okay then. I'll show you where you can rest, Yoi." Marco shot a glance at the fire near his feet. "First, though, please extinguish that. We already have enough cleanup thanks to you 3, we don't need more, Yoi." Ace grudgingly cancelled his little fire ring after Sabo nudged him in the side and with a pointed look. A small thread of amusement from Luffy had both brothers forming a small grin. Sabo gestured for Marco to take the lead. Ace made to follow the blue fire user, but stopped once he realized Thatch meant to follow behind them. Sensing Ace and Sabo not following after him, Marco turned to see the brothers glaring at Thatch. Guessing what the problem likely was, Marco motioned for the commander to walk next to him. Ace continued following with Sabo right behind him. "So what's with all these blankets and pillows? I get that since there are 3 of you and just the one bed, someone might get the floor. But do you really need 6 pillows and 8 big blankets? I'm pretty certain there's already a spare set in the guest room you're using." "Yes, Mr. Chef, we need them. Luffy and Ace have issues with sharing." Marco caught Thatch's confused and questioning look at that statement. "Don't act like you're any better, Sabo. I've seen you stealing pillows from Lou in the middle of the night. He stole them first and he hoards them. You steal most of the damn blankets. Between the two of you, I get left with nothing." Looking over at the 1st Division commander, Thatch saw both the man's thin eyebrows almost touching his hairline. Seriously, what was the relationship between these three kids? From the way they talk it's obvious they must at least share the same room, unless they sneak into each other's rooms to steal bed items. During the trip to collect the pillows and blankets, Thatch being subjected to playing the part of a pack mule, the two commanders had been trying to get the boys to talk to them. Marco had purposely taken a longer route to get the extra bed items and leading the Spade trio to the room he had picked for them. Thatch had tried to lag behind in the beginning so he could get a closer look at Luffy. He really was worried about the kid, and so was Marco, but whenever he got within 6 feet of Ace, the kid would let out a little growl. Ace, hearing the growl, would immediately attempt to set Thatch on fire until the man ran back up by Marco. By his expression alone, both commanders also bet that Sabo was trying to conjure daggers into existence to throw at the 4th commander. After the 6th time, Marco got fed up with his brother's antics and told Thatch to stop harassing the teens unless he wanted to be barbecued by the twitchy flame. Gradually, the boys loosened up enough to make polite conversation, Sabo, or to at least grunt in acknowledgement of a statement, Ace. Sometimes, before answering a question, the co-captains would get an odd look in their eye or simultaneously glance at the small pirate on Ace's back. Thatch could totally relate to Marco's statement about the conversation he'd had with the trio during Ace's Inferno stunt. They were learning a lot and yet nothing at all from these three. Once they had started answering questions relatively consistently, Thatch, seeing the fire still wrapped about the two non-fire users, asked if they were ever worried about being burned by Ace's flames. Marco had given more attention to the conversation at this point, curious about the reason behind the flames himself. The boys had just looked at the two older pirates like they were the stupidest people who just asked the equally stupidest question of all time. Wearing expressions of extreme confusion, Sabo and Ace asked simultaneously, "Why would they get burned?" After another minute of awkward and confused silence, the two younger pirates randomly grinned and darted fond looks at the small raven resting on Ace's back. The commanders decided to drop the topic of Ace's flames, and the five resumed the trek to the guest room. For some reason, after that botched topic the boys were more tolerant of Thatch's presence. He and Marco discovered this after Thatch unknowingly slowed down to talk a little better with Sabo. Ace had sent a lick of flame at the man, singeing the butt of his pants and keeping a small flame going there, as the teen grouchily demanded the loud idiot to get moving. When Thatch threw back the claim he wasn't an idiot and added an exaggerated pout, the two teens shared a knowing look before turning back to the man. Marco, finding the group lagging behind again, slowed down and turned back to see what Thatch was up in arms over. He didn't even bother to keep the amused grin off his face. Sabo and Ace wore an expression similar to one a saint might wear when trying to explain the world doesn't end at the horizon to an intellectually inept person. Except these two also had an evil glint in their eyes and shit-eating smirks. Sabo asked Ace if smart individuals walk around with a hole in their pants. Ace responded with a no and added that he did know only idiots walk around with their ass on fire. Thatch looked very confused until he caught the scent of something burning. Realization struck him pretty damn fast at that point. Luffy turned his head to stare at the chef running up and down the hall, screaming about being in danger of losing his jewels. Marco saw the kid tilt back into Ace's neck and mouth something before going back to largely ignoring them. Ace chuckled and leaned over to Sabo to whisper whatever the smaller boy had said to him, causing the blonde to laugh as well. Sabo got Ace to extinguish the mini fire, and Marco smacked Thatch upside the head, lightly, the next time the man went screaming by him. The troop went back to walking, and it was then Thatch realized how close he'd gotten to the fire teen without the Straw Hat Kid growling at him. Marco noticed as well and dropped back a little closer to the trio to see if the same applied to him. The team captains tensed while Luffy peeked out at him and Thatch, before the kid resumed ignoring them. The two slowly relaxed and continued talking over the next couple minutes. Thatch had noticed Luffy whisper something when he'd been on fire earlier and asked the captain duo what he'd said. Sabo smirked as he said, "Lou told Ace that you were kind of smart for an idiot." The chef looked at his brother before he shot a questioning glance at the duo following them. Full out grinning at the commander's implied question, the top-hated blonde told the Whitebeards why the statement was so funny. Sabo explained that since Ace had described idiots as people who go about with their butts on fire, Luffy had been surprised Thatch knew Ace was referring to the commander when the teen had demanded for a loud idiot to get moving. Luffy had also been surprised at the commander's obedience towards Ace. Marco was quick to stifle a laugh, while Thatch just spluttered at the laughing co-captains. "I just got insulted twice over in one sentence by a kid who's basically sleeping," Thatch thought. They were getting close to the room the three would be using to rest in when Thatch had broached the subject of the quantity of pillows and blankets the two pirates had requested. which led to the odd revelation of the three's apparent tendency to steal each other's blankets and pillows on what sounded to be a regular basis. Seeing as their guard was lowered even more if they were willing to divulge this information or were so tired they just didn't care, Marco thought now might be the best time to try and get a little piece of information that had been bugging him. Putting on an air of disinterest, the Phoenix nonchalantly asked, "So, how are you three related to each other, Yoi?" Ace and Sabo immediately came to a halt, Ace tightening his hold on Luffy while his flames grew a little larger and moved a touch erratically. Luffy raised his head up and swiveled half-lidded dark eyes between his companions and Marco and Thatch. The latter commander shot concerned looks at the trio and a puzzled but slightly irritated one at his blonde brother. "And we finally got them cozy enough to talk with us. Now Marco makes them to clam up by trying to go too far." Yes, Thatch would admit he was curious about their relationship, especially with the talk of pillow blanket stealing, but he thought would be topic best left until after the three had gotten some sleep and food in them. Shrugging his shoulders, Marco turned around and walked for another few paces until he stopped outside a door down the hall. Opening it and checking inside to see that it hadn't been turned into a storage room by one of his brothers, the blonde motioned the others forward. Thatch had to go first as the teens still hadn't allowed him to walk behind them. As they drew even the purple-jacketed pirate, Marco tilted his head to indicate the room next to him as he said, "You can rest here, Yoi. I'll make sure no one comes by to disturb you three." Knowing how touchy the trio was over their personal space, Marco nudged Thatch into the room to deposit their burdens on the only bed in it. They exited and waited off to the side for the three to enter and inspect the space. Ace walked in with Luffy and looked around while Sabo stayed near the door. Thatch recognized this as a show of defending the other captain while keeping watch for anything the two commanders might do. Seeing Ace send a nod at Sabo, Marco and Thatch bade them goodbye and turned to leave. "About your question," both commanders looked back at the top-hatted blonde. Sabo was shooting uncertain glances at Ace and Luffy and looking at Marco and Thatch as if they were puzzles he was trying to solve. Ace was completely stiff as he glared at the commanders, darting concerned and equally uncertain gray eyes to his two friends. Marco frowned internally. "No, that's not quite right, Yoi." He looked at the scene again, wanting to make sure he was reading the three's body language right. Looking askance at Thatch, he saw that his brother seemed to catch on as well. The co-captains appeared to be looking for some sort answer from the youngest of the trio. Ace gave a slight shrug of the shoulder Luffy was using as a headrest. Letting out a small plaintive whine at the jostling, Strawwhat moved his head to swivel tired eyes around the room until they met those of the older teens. The shrimp stared at the two young captains for a couple seconds before he turned an assessing gaze onto the chef and Phoenix. Having the Straw Hat Kid's focus directed at them like this was discomforting to Thatch and Marco, an odd heaviness hidden in it. An ethereal weight that wanted to prevent them from hiding while those dark eyes seemed to stare into their souls. A heartbeat later found the weird sensation gone and the kids sending warm looks to Sabo and Ace. The former pirate eased his muscles to a relaxed state and gave the youngest a fond smile in return. The latter co-captain only relaxed his shoulders, keeping the rest of his body tense to attack or defend while continuing to glare at the division leaders. Turning back to the Whitebeard pirates, Sabo continued, "We're brothers. That's how we are related to each other. Ace is our older brother and Luffy is our baby brother." Luffy pouted hearing himself described as the baby, but didn't refute it. Smiling, likely at the commander's stunned and shocked faces, the top hat wearer finished with saying, "Thanks for showing us to the room." He then proceeded to shut the door in their face. Thatch turned and gave a shaky smile to the first division leader. "Well, he supposed that answers several questions. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support the BlueMoonChaos for writing that awesome fanfic and also make sure to comment on this story link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.